Hey guys, I'm Sun. I'm a privacy and a security researcher, and you're watching the Privacy Guides. In last episode, I explained why, in my opinion, an iPhone or any other smartphone cannot be considered a private device. If you haven't watched that episode, I would recommend watching it first, as it kind of hints to what we're going to be discussing today. That being said, in today's episode, I'm going to share with you guys the settings that I tweak on my iPhone to make sure that it's as private as possible. But to be clear, I don't consider my iPhone as private as my Mac. Okay, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in. I need to start screen recording and we should be all set. Cool. Okay. So I'll be looking at my screen. As I mentioned in earlier episodes, right here I have a 27-inch screen. There's a lot of steps that we need to go through to make your iPhone a little more private and secure. So yeah, let's jump in. First things first, if we go into settings, we want to make sure that Wi-Fi is disabled when you're not home. As I mentioned in last episode, Wi-Fi is used to track you and track others. So disabling Wi-Fi is actually a great thing for your own privacy and the privacy of others. If you haven't watched that episode again, I really recommend watching it before this one. I'll link it in the description and up here or up there. I'm not sure which side it is, but you know what I mean. So I'll leave it on right now because I might need Wi-Fi and I'm home. So that's cool. Same goes for Bluetooth. If Bluetooth is enabled, I really recommend disabling it. With the current crisis, a lot of governments are considering using BLE, so Bluetooth Low Energy Proximity Detection, to know if you've been close to someone, etc., etc. I don't want this video to be flagged, so I'll keep things a little abstract. But you really want to make sure Bluetooth isn't enabled unless you really have to have it enabled. So for instance, I enable Bluetooth on my personal phone when I need to configure my Bose noise canceling headphones, and then I disable it. So we'll leave it disabled right now. I don't have a SIM card in this, so I cannot demo this, but if you go in cellular, you want to make sure Wi-Fi calling is disabled, and you want to also make sure that calls on other devices is disabled. I really like security and privacy by compartmentalizing things. That was compartmentalizing. Is that even a word? We'll say it is. But you want to make sure that your Mac is your Mac and your phone is your phone, that they don't share as much configuration as your phone might want you to by default. Okay, so if we go in notifications, by default, show preview is set to always. That means that if your phone is locked and someone sends you a text message, a preview of that text message will be available. What that means is if you're using a provider, sometimes your bank, for instance, that has SMS two-factor authentication, that means that if someone steals your phone, somehow that person has access to your password, well, they now have access to your 2FA, even if they don't have your fingerprint or your passcode to your phone, because it's shown to them. So you want to make sure that this here is set to when unlocked. Siri suggestions, we want to disable all of it. So we want to essentially disable as much of Siri as possible. Unfortunately, it's very deeply interconnected in iOS, so it requires a lot of work. I won't do all of those right now on camera, but you want to disable all of those here. Once this is done, you may have configured apps in the past where show previews is actually enabled. So you want to make sure that you go through all of your apps one by one and double check that show previews is set to when unlocked. Now that that's done, let's move along. If we go in screen time, I recommend never enabling screen time. What screen time does is it essentially tracks what you're doing on your phone, and it then lets you know about, how much time you spent on this or that app, whatever. That means that your phone is essentially logging everything you're doing, and what you're doing on your phone or your computer, well, that's your own business. I wouldn't go about recording that for historical purposes. Yes, if we go in general, we want to go in about and we want to change the name. As you can see here, it's called iPhone, which is good. But if you're restoring this from, say, a backup you have or something like this, it may be called something like your first name's iPhone. So we want to make sure that we spoof the name. And for the purpose of this, we're going to call it John's iPhone. Okay, now that that's done, if you go in General Software Updates, you want to make sure that updates are not enabled by default. You want to make sure that when when an update is suggested to you, you want to make sure that this update is audited by yourself. You want to make sure you know what it's doing on your phone, because an update could include privacy invading features that you may not want, and it's pretty hard on iOS to actually, undo an update. Now, I'm not sure why this here is not working for us. Give me a second. Oh, the Wi-Fi is not connected. Okay. So as I mentioned, let's connect here. This I'll have to blur. Sorry about that. Now, you may notice that my password is not very long on my Wi-Fi network, and there's a reason for that, and that will be the subject of a future episode. So if you're into this kind of stuff, smash that subscribe button and we'll get there. Okay, so where were we? We were in General and we were in Software Updates. So once we're here, as you can see, automatic updates is disabled. It might be enabled on your device, so I really recommend disabling that and then updating when you feel the update isn't invading your privacy and stuff like this. Now that that's done, if we go in hand off, as I mentioned, that's something that we want to disable. We don't want our computer and our phone to be deeply linked together, so that's cool. Moving on to background app refresh. If you don't know what background app refresh is, it's a feature that was introduced on iOS probably about at the same time as multitasking. What it does is it allows apps to run stuff in the background. So for instance, the Facebook native app can start fetching stuff so that when you go on the app, your feed is already preloaded. That means that the app can be doing things without you even knowing about it. So I really recommend disabling background app refresh. That being said, you might have an app that you want to synchronize in the background. For instance, I use Fantastical, which is a calendar app, and I want it to be able to synchronize in the background, so I have to authorize that in background mode. But for everything else, you want to make sure that you disable that here. Now that that's done, let's go to, everything else here is good. Let's go to Siri and search. As I mentioned, we want to disable as much as we can of Siri as possible, and that requires a lot of work, but let's do this. You want to disable everything here. Now, for all of these apps here, you want to disable Siri suggestions and disable show app. And as you can see, this requires a lot of tapping. I won't do them all on camera because there's a lot of those here, but you want to make sure you disable that for all of them. It's a one-time thing, and it's definitely worth your time. Okay. Yes. Now, okay, Touch ID and passcode. So you want to make sure that you only allow Touch ID to unlock your phone. I mentioned that in the episodes on two-factor authentication. If you're using Touch ID for, say, your login to the phone and your banking app or your password manager, that means that I can whack you on the head, and then I have access to your phone and to the apps within the phone using your fingerprint. So that's pretty poor from an OPSEC perspective. If you want to learn more about InfoSec versus OPSEC, you can search that on my channel, and there's an episode dedicated to that. Okay, so let's turn on passcode, and we want to click here on passcode options, and we want to use a custom alphanumerical code. So that's going to be essentially the same kind of level of security that I recommended for your Mac in my first episode of this privacy guide series on how to configure macOS for privacy. So to summarize that, you want a password that's between 12 and 14 characters long. You don't want to make it overkill long because you're going to be entering it pretty often. And you don't want to use your name, your child's name, or your date of birth. You want to use something that's imaginative and that isn't in a dictionary. So if I try to do a social engineering attack against you, that won't work. And if I'm trying to do a dictionary attack against you, it won't work either. And you also want to make sure that you're never using that password for your password manager, your 2FA app, or your crypto wallets or anything else. So that is what I call your device password. If you want to learn more about that philosophy, you can look at the episode on configuring macOS for privacy. So since you're going to be seeing this password, I'm going to put a password that is really shitty. And it's actually so shitty that the iPhone is letting me know about it. So that's kind of hilarious. But I'm going to use it anyway because you're going to be seeing this. So it's ASD. Same password that I have on my Mac dedicated to those guides. You absolutely do not want to use a password that's that shitty. Again, something between 12 and 14, blah, blah, blah. I just said it, so you're good. Okay, so somehow my passwords did not match. Use anyway. What am I doing here? Jesus. Sorry about that. Now that we did that, we want to make sure that we use Touch ID to unlock the iPhone. And I won't configure all my fingers. I'll just go ahead and configure my right thumb. So let's do this here. Okay, adjust your grip. So now we're doing the edges of our fingerprint. Okay, so I recommend at least doing your thumb and your index, I think that's what it's called, and your index on the other hand, in case your hands get hurt or something like this. So that's pretty cool. And once this is done, as you see, it wants to enable this stuff for all kinds of things. So you want to disable Apple Pay, you want to disable password autofill. Now moving on, you want to make sure that you require your passcode immediately. And then you want to disable all of this stuff. So by default, it lets you do a lot when your phone is locked, and you don't want that. I mean, unlocking it using your fingerprint is such an easy thing. All of this should be disabled, and you want to enable erase data. That means that if you try the wrong password 10 times in a row, it's going to kill your phone. It will delete all of the information. So you have to be careful with that setting, but I recommend it since your phone might be lost somewhere outside in the wild. Okay, moving along to privacy. If you go into privacy, by default, location services is enabled. So that's definitely something that we want to disable. Now, you will be probably using something such as Google Map for navigation, and that's okay, but you want to make sure that you only enable location services when you need it, okay? So as you can see here, my camera, it's while using. I would recommend never allowing your camera to track your location. That means your pictures won't be jail tagged, but that's actually how some gangsters got caught. It's something that's very bad. You don't want your pictures to have the jail tag because then someone can retrace where you were and stuff like this, even if the picture itself does not reveal much. Now, Google Maps is set to always. I just want to, I only want to enable location services when I'm using the app. Now, if I go into, actually share my location is grayed out because I didn't configure this phone with an Apple ID, but you absolutely don't want to share your location. I guess that's pretty obvious. If we go in system services, you want to disable everything here. That means that things such as, the phone detecting your time zone automatically will no longer work, but it also means that your phone will stop trying to track you everywhere you go. And that's pretty essential. Now, significant locations, that's one of the scariest things on iOS. If I click here and enter my fingerprint, now this phone, I haven't used it in the wild. I'm only using it to show you guys settings here because I didn't want to use my personal one to keep some of my privacy. But essentially, significant locations, by default, your iPhone will track all significant locations you've been. So your house will show up here, your office will show up there. If you're into having a mistress or something, that will show up here. You absolutely want to make sure that you disable that. And you'll see on your phone, actually, if this wasn't disabled, you'll see a bunch of locations. Have a look before you go ahead and clear them, but there's a button that you can click to clear all significant locations from your phone. I don't know why Apple does this. It's really scary, but yeah, go ahead and disable that. Now it still shows as on. I think it takes a little bit of time to, now it's off. Now in product improvements, you want to disable iPhone analytics, popular near me, routing and traffic. And now the only one that should be enabled is actually disabled by default, and that's status bar icon. That means that when your phone is using your location, a little thing will show up near the battery to let you know that it is. That's pretty insightful. Okay, so there we are. We're doing some pretty great progress. As you can see, there's a lot of things we need to do. And I've rehearsed a few times this episode before being able to film it right now. And I'm a little exhausted, but you know what? We'll plow through it. It's a one-time thing and it's absolutely worth it for our privacy. So now you see I'm not using navigation or anything, so I disable location services altogether. Whew. Okay, now that we did that, as you can see under here, there's contacts, calendars, reminders. Your phone has a bunch of APIs that apps can use to access, your contacts or your calendar. Say you're using Signal, you would probably want it to access your contacts. But if I go in microphone, well, why does Google Maps needs access to my microphone, for instance? Well, I don't think it does, so I can go ahead and untick that. And if I go into, let me see, is there something else? If I go into, yeah, no, nothing else here is configured. If I click on camera, you see, but you guys have a bunch of apps. You would absolutely want to go in each one of those apps and look at, well, do I want it to have access to my microphone? Do I want it to have access to my contacts? So if I click on contacts, for instance, Signal would show up there. And okay, Signal is cool, but do we want Facebook to have access to our contacts? Probably not. Do you want to have the Facebook app on your phone? Probably not, actually. But you know what? Okay, moving along. Yes, okay, so if we go into privacy and we scroll all the way down in analytics, this is disabled on my phone because I disabled that when I actually installed it from scratch, but yours is probably enabled. You want to make sure that analytics is disabled. And when you go into advertising, you want to make sure that limit ad tracking is enabled, and you want to reset your advertising identifier. That's something that a bunch of apps use to actually track you, know a little bit more about your identity. So that's done. Okay. Yes. So moving along to iTunes and App Store, you want to make sure, as I mentioned, for iOS updates that app updates are not enabled by default, and at least not automatic, And if you have an Apple ID linked to your phone, you'll see four little things here that you need to disable in automatic downloads, and you want to disable in-app ratings and reviews. Now that that's done, let's go down to passwords and accounts. Well, as you can see, I'm not using my phone. I'm not using iOS built-in password manager, and I believe you shouldn't either. If you're using a password manager such as 1Password, that's where you would want your passwords to live. And I actually really like 1Password. I found it's a great password manager from a UI UX perspective. And it has a feature that not a lot of people know about that allows you to synchronize your passwords between your computer and your phone using your local network. I publish an episode on that, so you can search 1Password on my channel and you'll see that. Hey guys, Son of the Future here. I'm currently editing this episode, and I noticed that since I didn't have an Apple ID configured, iCloud did not show up in accounts. Now, one thing that you want to make sure you disable is iCloud backups. What that means is a full copy of your phone's content is uploaded to iCloud servers. I would recommend disabling that and using iTunes to do a backup using your USB cable. That is a much more sovereign approach to this. All right, back to Son of the Past. So if you have passwords that are stored, now I'm at 0, but you might have some, I recommend deleting them once you know that they're elsewhere, and disabling autofill passwords for sure. Okay, now if we go into phone, sorry about that. If we go into phone, probably on your device, since you have a SIM card, well, if you click there, you may want to mask your caller ID, and that's actually where it's done. If you want to be able to call people without they knowing your phone number, well, that's what you would enable. If we go in messages, so there's no Apple ID linked to this phone, but in messages, you would want to disable, you would want to set keep messages to 30 days. And the same logic goes for Firefox. If you looked at my episode on Firefox, the one on configuring Firefox for privacy, well, I recommended I'm becoming a little tired here. I'm sorry about that. Jesus, wake up. Okay. On the episode in Firefox, we went about making it so that when you quit Firefox, all of your history, all of the data, cookies, data, etc., is flushed. And that's good. You don't want your device to have personal data on it. You want as little as possible so that if ever someone seizes your phone, and is successful to decrypt it or forces you to decrypt it, you want as little information to be on it as possible. So setting messages to 30 days is pretty good. That being said, I would recommend using Signal instead of messages, but that will be the subject of another episode. So if you're into this kind of stuff, smash that subscribe button and we're going to get there pretty shortly. Okay. Now, if we go into Safari, I really recommend using Firefox instead of Safari, and that will be the subject of another episode. But in the meantime, sometimes Safari opens by default. So we still want to make sure that our settings are good. So we want to disable Siri and suggestions. We want to make sure the search engine is DuckDuckGo. And then we want to disable pretty much everything. So you want to disable search engine suggestions, Safari suggestions, quick website search, preload top hits, and then you want to disable frequently visited websites. You want to enable block pop-ups. That's totally fine. You want to enable prevent cross-site tracking. That's pretty fine. But then you want to essentially disable everything else. And if you're a developer, you can go in advance and you can enable Web Inspector. That's totally cool. Now, moving along, if you go into settings at the bottom, that's where all of your apps reside. If you click on those apps, you want to make sure that the settings here are good. That's a way of double checking a lot of steps that we did in previous steps. You want to make sure that location is set to something that's reasonable in the context of Google Maps. Now it says never because location services is fully disabled, but that would be essentially while using once location services is enabled. You want to make sure that your microphone is disabled. You want to make sure that Siri suggestions is disabled and background app refresh is disabled. So we talked about that in previous steps. I won't go into too much detail, but you want to double check those one by one. So as I mentioned, I recommend using Firefox as your browser, Signal for messaging, OTP auth for two-factor authentication, and a dedicated password manager versus the built-in one. I really like 1Password, but there's a bunch of others that are totally cool. And last but not least, you want to be careful about what you install on your phone. So if an app is installed that you don't really need, like say iTunes Store, I don't need iTunes Store. So you can click on it and delete it. And same goes for home. I'm not doing any home automation stuff. Same for books. So I won't go through all of them one by one, but you want to go about deleting as much stuff as possible because all of these apps add clutter, add stuff that you need to have on your radar, and you need to make sure that those apps are respecting your privacy. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I'm just looking at my notes to make sure I didn't forget anything. There's a whole bunch of points here. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. I know that was a lot. I mean, I'm feeling exhausted by just doing this run with you guys, but it's worth it. Now, keep in mind that your iPhone should not be considered a private device, unfortunately, even if we would want it to. So if you like these kinds of episodes, if you're not a subscriber yet, smash that subscribe button. A lot more coming. I'll see you guys soon. Bye-bye.